They were born into hymns, but no hymn ever left their lips. The Ashford family promised the world a choir, an eternal offering of devotion. Yet, the only sound that remains is silence. Their chapel still stands. The pews are empty. The hymnals remain open. And the walls remember. This is not the story of music, but of how silence devoured a family whole. Under a low gray sky, the fields breathe mist. The camera drifts across the wet earth, past hedgerows bent in the wind, until it settles on a single house rising from the damp horizon. Its walls are pale stone. Its roof carries the weight of centuries. And yet, in 1824, it was new. The Ashford home. It was not built for comfort, not for warmth, not for wealth. It was built for sound. The family had money, more than most in that quiet parish of rural England. Generations of trade and land had fattened their accounts. But what they chose to spend it on was strange. Instead of halls of oak or painted ceilings, they hired architects to study echoes. They ordered masons to carve chambers that bent the voice. They called in builders not to fit drawing rooms, but to align walls so that music could swell and rebound like breath trapped in a body. Because the Ashfords had announced a mission, a divine mission. They said their bloodline would become a choir, not just a family, not just heirs to land or name, but a choir of blood. The parish was bewildered. Some whispered it was vanity. Others believed it was piety. But no one could deny the Ashfords' devotion. They spoke of sacred song as though it were scripture. They spoke of music not as art, but as duty. And so the house was raised, a home shaped less like a manor and more like an instrument. Its corridors were narrow, amplifying footsteps into a slow rhythm. Its ceilings arched high above the floor, tuned to carry a voice longer than it should last. Even the stairwell seemed designed for resonance, spiraling so that sound climbed with the one who made it. The house was not warm. It was not gentle. It was precise. When the family moved in, villagers said it sounded as though the house breathed. At night, when the wind pressed against the stone, the windows gave a long hum, a tone stretched across the dark fields. Some said it was beautiful. Some said it was not. But the Ashfords were pleased. Inside those walls, they began their work. Richard Ashford, the patriarch, was tall, strict, and calm in speech. He spoke of God in measured tones, never raising his voice, as though afraid it might break the air. His wife, Margaret, was softer, but just as devout. Together, they gathered their children, 5 in all, each at different stages of youth, and they told them what their lives would be. Not merchants, not farmers, not soldiers. They would sing. Every day began with scales. Every evening ended with hymns. The children's voices filled the corridors until the house itself seemed to answer. Their meals were eaten in silence. Their play was limited. Every choice they made was bent toward harmony. At first, the villagers admired them. To hear the Ashfords at church was to hear something rare. The youngest, barely 7, could hold a note with startling purity. The eldest carried strength and command. Together, their sound was fuller than any choir the parish had ever known. But something wasn't right. The family stopped mixing with others. They no longer dined with neighbors, no longer joined gatherings. The children were rarely seen in the village at all. It was said they were being sheltered. That Richard did not want worldly voices corrupting the purity of his bloodline's tone. The children were schooled at home, their tutors carefully chosen. Everything external, every distraction, was pared away. The Ashfords were sealing themselves off. The house that had been built for sound now became a kind of cloister, a place where voices echoed, but never escaped. And in that stillness, something began to change. Those who worked the fields nearby claimed they sometimes heard practice sessions carry across the wind. The voices were clear, piercing, yet strangely uniform, as though the children were not individuals at all, but one body breathing in unison. And that frightened people, because it no longer sounded like a choir. It sounded like a single, endless voice. Inside, the regimen grew harsher. The children were woken before dawn, their voices tested against the cold air. Meals were withheld when notes wavered. Hours of repetition drove their small throats raw. Margaret, though gentler, enforced discipline with unwavering obedience. One child, the second youngest, was said to have cried during practice. A neighbor delivering supplies claimed she heard the sound, small, broken weeping carried out through the stone. She said it didn't last long, that it was quickly swallowed by the swell of hymns. The Ashfords denied it. They always denied it. But the villagers began to turn away. What had seemed noble now seemed obsessive. What had sounded divine now sounded forced. And as the years passed, the family grew less like patrons, more like zealots. Richard preached that blood was not just lineage, but resonance, that through discipline, through sacrifice, his descendants would carry a sound that could not be corrupted, a sacred choir that would echo long after their bodies were gone. It was devotion, it was madness, and the house bore witness. Stone walls carried every note, every error, every punishment. The children's footsteps were measured in rhythm, their breaths trained in unison. Visitors said it felt less like entering a home than stepping inside an instrument, one already humming with an unseen song. By 1830, the parish avoided the Ashfords. The family rarely attended services outside their own walls. Rumors spread of voices heard at impossible hours, of hymns stretched far beyond human breath, of children who never seemed to age, only to harden into discipline. The house stood apart, its windows like unblinking eyes, its halls full of sound no one wanted to hear. And though the Ashfords believed they were building a legacy of harmony, what they were truly building was something else, something the village would come to fear. Because behind the locked doors, behind the forced rehearsals and endless notes, the children were no longer just learning to sing. They were learning to obey. And obedience in that house meant silence. The choir was almost ready, but not for the parish, not for the world, only for the family. And that was the beginning. The camera lingers on stone, pale wet with moss, stretching upward into an arch that seems taller than it should be. The lens drifts along its curve, tracing lines cut by hand, following each groove until it disappears into shadow. This was the Ashford estate, but unlike other homes of its time, it was not built for shelter. It was not built for comfort. It was built to listen. The ceilings were not flat but rounded, bent in strange geometry. Halls ran long and straight, then opened into vaults where sound did not vanish, but circled, clung, multiplied. Each chamber was designed not for the body, but for the voice. And it showed, because in the Ashford house, nothing was ever quiet. The simplest sound, a cough, a breath, a whisper, lingered long after it should have ended. Servants said that when they dropped a spoon in the kitchen, they heard it ring as if the walls were struck like bells. Children laughing in one corridor could be heard 2 rooms away, their voices stretched thin, ghosted into something not quite human. At first, it was marvelous, a kind of wonder. Guests remarked on it, smiling as their own words came back to them, layered faintly beneath their speech. But wonder, in time, turned to unease, because the echoes did not fade quickly. They stayed. A phrase spoken in passing could return minutes later, carried from some unseen corner of the house. One servant swore she heard her own prayer repeat itself while she was alone, as though the walls had stored it and chosen to release it back. The Ashfords insisted this was sacred, proof their home was blessed, that voices offered in devotion would never be lost, but preserved, hanging in the air like incense, eternal. But something wasn't right. The villagers noticed first. Farmers working the fields at dusk claimed that the house itself seemed to sing, that on still nights, with no one outside, the wind carried tones from its windows, not melodies, not songs, just long, held notes like breath trapped in stone. And inside, the servants began to suffer. At night, in their narrow beds, they heard things that should not have been heard. Whispers, footsteps, the scrape of wood across stone. Some claimed the sounds were not real, that they were tricks of the ear in such an echoing space. But others were not so sure. One footman told a visiting tradesman that he had begun to dread the chapel wing. The chapel had been the heart of the design, a narrow space, rising high into a rounded dome. The floor was plain wood, the walls bare plaster. Nothing decorative, nothing distracting, It was geometry, nothing more. But when the Ashfords sang there, the sound shook the air until those listening felt their ribs vibrate. The footman said he could not walk past it at night, because even when empty, the chapel was never silent. It seemed to hold sound long after rehearsals ended. You could walk through its doors hours later and still hear faint breathing, faint murmurs, as though a service had just concluded. He said it was like stepping into a throat that never stopped swallowing. Others agreed. No one wanted to sleep near that wing. The maids begged to be housed in the far rooms, away from the chapel. Some left their posts entirely, unable to rest inside walls that would not release sound. And Richard Ashford, he dismissed their fears. To him, the servants were weak, distracted by superstition. He argued that the lingering notes were signs of divine blessing, that God had given their house a gift, to preserve the voices of his praise. Margaret agreed, though more softly, reminding the children that holiness often felt heavy, that sacrifice required discomfort, but the children themselves felt it too. At night, in their beds, they whispered to one another that the house was listening, that it caught their words and held them, even the ones spoken in secrecy. They said you could not lie inside those walls, because the echo would betray you. One daughter, the third born, began refusing to speak except during practice. She claimed that when she tried to talk to her sister in the dark, her own words returned not in her voice, but in another's. A low tone, far too deep, repeated her confession back. Her parents told her it was imagination, but the fear in her eyes said otherwise. And then came the moment that changed everything. A carpenter, hired to make repairs in the west corridor, was working alone. He struck his hammer to a nail once, twice, and paused. He swore that when he lifted his head, he heard a second set of strikes from behind the wall. He left his tools that day. He never returned. From then on, the house carried a reputation. Whispers in the village turned from curiosity to suspicion. Farmers joked bitterly that the Ashfords had built not a home, but an ear, a great listening ear press against their parish. Children dared one another to run up to the gates and shout insults, then sprint away before their words were swallowed. Few did it twice, because when their words came back, they did not sound the same. The echoes were wrong. They stretched, shifted, distorted into tones that were too sharp or too low. One boy claimed he heard his own voice laugh when he had not. His parents forbade him from going near the grounds again. Inside, the servants dwindled. Few could tolerate the unease. The house grew quieter, less populated. But in that quiet, the Ashfords sang louder. Richard drove his family harder, filling every corridor with rehearsals, every chamber with scales. He said the walls must be saturated with holy sound, that no idle word should touch the geometry God had inspired. The children obeyed, but in their silence between sessions, they listened to what remained, because the notes they released did not always leave. One son claimed he heard his sister's song continue after she stopped. Another swore he heard his mother's hymn humming beneath the floorboards when no one was near. And that was the horror, because the Ashfords believed they were shaping the house to serve their choir. But what they did not realize was that the house itself had become the choir. It held every note, every word, every breath, and though no one admitted aloud, each of them began to feel the same terrible truth, that the house did not just hear them, it remembered them, and that memory was growing stronger. By 1832, no servant remained in the chapel wing. Rooms nearest its doors were sealed, unused. The air there grew damp, stale, as though too much sound had pushed out all breath. The children walked quickly past, eyes lowered, refusing to glance at the open dome where silence was never silence. Even Margaret began to falter. At night, she confessed to Richard that she heard voices call when she closed her eyes, echoes from prayers she had not spoken in years. Richard dismissed her, stern, commanding. He could not allow weakness to taint the mission. But she no longer believed the house was only holy, and the children, they stopped sleeping, because whenever they drifted near dreams, the walls seemed to whisper, their own voices, repeating, twisting, asking them to join. The house that heard every note was beginning to speak back, and none of them knew if they could silence it. Mist coils low across the meadow. The lens drifts forward, slow, steady, until the Ashford house rises once more. Its windows dark, its stone walls damp, its silhouette swollen against the pale sky. Inside, the air is heavy, thick with the faint weight of breath. By the year 1834, the family had grown. 7 children now lived within those walls. Each one was pale, disciplined, and silent. From birth, their lives have been measured not by milestones of joy, but by exercises of breath. Where other infants were soothed with songs, the Ashford children were quieted by rhythm. Inhale, exhale, pause. They were held to their mother's chest not for comfort, but so they might feel their lungs expand and contract. They were taught to listen before they were taught to speak. Margaret sat with them daily, training their small bodies into the rituals of control. Breath held until tears welled. Breath released and thin, steady streams. Breath cut short at command. Even their games, when they were allowed any, were silent contests of endurance. Who could remain still the longest? Who could breathe without sound? Laughter was forbidden. Crying was punished. Speech was rare. Their voices were not for themselves. They were for the choir. And so the children grew into silence. The villagers began to notice. When the Ashfords passed through the parish, the air around them seemed still. No chatter, no clatter of shoes. The children moved in unison, their eyes lowered, their steps too measured. It unsettled those who saw them. Other children ran wild in the lanes, shouted, called to one another. But the Ashfords' brood walked as though rehearsing some invisible ritual. Not one was ever heard to sing. And that was the most disturbing part. For all Richard's proclamations, for all the family's supposed mission, the children never once opened their mouths in public. The church congregation never heard their voices. The village festivals passed without their songs. The family's garden remained soundless, though filled with young life. To see them at a distance was to see children, but to hear them was to hear nothing. And silence, when it lingers too long, grows unbearable. One neighbor, a seamstress who lived closest to the estate, remarked that when the children played outside their walls, the meadow seemed to hold its breath. The birds grew quiet. The insects hushed. Even the wind slowed. She said it was as though the world bent itself to match the family's stillness. But something wasn't right. A delivery boy, sent to bring flour to the kitchen, claimed that while he waited for the door to be opened, he saw 3 of the Ashford children staring from an upstairs window. Their mouths were closed, their eyes blank, and though he heard no sound, he swore their chests were rising and falling together in perfect rhythm. Not like breathing, like counting. The villagers began to whisper. They said the Ashfords were raising their children like monks, cloistered in discipline, that no joy entered their lives, only the endless preparation for song. Some said the parents believed that to laugh was to cheapen the voice, to waste breath meant for God. Others suspected darker things, that silence itself was being worshipped, that the family had shifted from praising the divine to praising their own control. The truth was harder. Inside those walls, the children's every hour was bound to breath and prayer. Dawn began with kneeling. Midday was spent in postures of stillness. Nights ended with long silences. The family gathered together, waiting in the dim light, as though listening for something no one else could hear. Richard's sermons to his family were not of love or play, but of duty. He told them their lungs were vessels, that their blood was chosen to carry resonance beyond human measure. He told them that to waste a single sound was to betray generations. And so they obeyed. The children did not laugh. They did not cry. They did not sing. Only breath. And the house itself held that breath, amplifying it, multiplying it, carrying it through its strange halls until it seemed to seep from the very walls. Servants who remained swore they heard sighs moving to the corridors at night, though no one was there, as if the house had taken the children's exercises and kept them, looping them forever in its geometry. One maid, tasked with tending the nursery, confessed that she had not heard the youngest cry even once, not in hunger, not in pain. She said the baby's eyes would well with tears, but no sound would come, only a trembling breath, as though even an infant's voice had been forbidden, and that terrified her, because children cry. Children must cry, but in the Ashford house they didn't. The stillness grew unbearable. The parish began to avoid the family entirely. Where once they had been admired for their devotion, now they were feared. The silence of the children felt unnatural, almost contagious. Villagers spoke of dreams which they saw the Ashford brood standing at the edges of their fields, watching without blinking, without speaking. No one invited them to gatherings anymore. No one wanted them near. And yet, each Sunday, Richard appeared with his family in church. 7 children, motionless in pews, eyes downcast, their lips sealed. The only sound they ever made was the synchronized draw and release of their breath. Those who sat near them said it felt like a wind moving through the room, unnatural in its rhythm. And then came the moment that deepened suspicion. One evening, a farmhand passing the Ashford estate stopped at the sound of movement. Through the open gate, he saw the children in the garden, 7 of them, standing in a row, their faces tilted upward, their hands clasped before them, their lips closed, and yet the air moved. He swore he felt pressure in his ears, like the air itself was swelling with a sound just beyond hearing. He stepped closer, listening, and that's when he heard it. Not voices, not song, but breath. 7 streams, rising and falling together, drawn so slow, so measured, that it felt less like life and more like ritual. He stumbled back, unsettled, and ran. He never passed by the estate again. The silence was no longer just absence. It was presence. It filled every corner of the house, every step in the parish, every dream of those who crossed their path. It was as though the Ashford children had been emptied of all joy, all spontaneity, leaving only one thing behind: obedience. And in that obedience lay something darker, because silence can be gentle, but silence can also be command. And the villagers began to wonder if what they were hearing, or not hearing, was no longer choice, but control. The Ashford children did not sing, but the house around them was waiting. And waiting has a sound all its own. The church doors groaned as they opened. Light spilled across the pews, dust swimming in the air like ash. The villagers came slowly, filing into rows, their footsteps heavy against the wooden floorboards. 100 faces turned toward the altar, waiting. It was the Ashford's announcement. For years, the parish had spoken of their mission, of a family set apart, of children raised not for laughter, not for play, but for one purpose alone: to sing. Now, at last, Richard Ashford had declared their debut, a hymn performed not by any choir, but by his bloodline. The family of silence was about to open its mouth. Curiosity was stronger than suspicion. Every pew filled. Farmers, merchants, widows, children, all came. Even those who had turned away from the Ashfords could not resist. The air was thick with anticipation, restless whispers rising before the first note. At the front, the children stood in a row. 7 of them, their hands clasped before them, their faces pale, their eyes lowered. Richard and Margaret hovered behind, severe, proud, unyielding. The silence before performance is always long, but this silence felt longer. A clock ticked somewhere in the rafters. Someone coughed, and then the signal was given. The children lifted their heads, their lips parted, and nothing came out. The silence deepened. At first, the congregation assumed it was hesitation, stage fright, perhaps. The youngest might falter, the eldest might lead them in. People leaned forward, smiling thinly, waiting for the sound that must surely follow. But the sound did not follow. Their mouths remained open, motionless. Their chests rose and fell, but no voice escaped, no harmony, no hymn, only silence. It stretched across the pews like a veil. And that was when unease began to stir, because silence is never just silence. It has weight, texture. It grows heavy when it lasts too long. And this silence was unbearable. Mothers shifted, pulling children close. Men cleared their throats. But the children on the altar did not move. Their mouths stayed parted, their throats straining, as if something were caught between breath and release. But something wasn't right. A man in the second row swore he heard something faint, not singing, but echoes, thin, far away, like the last note of bell that had long since stopped ringing. He turned to the woman beside him, but she Two was frozen, listening. Others began to hear it as well. A ghost of sound, a faint reverberation. Not melody, not words, just a residue of music, as if the hymn had already been sung by someone else, somewhere else, and was now drifting back in delayed return. The air shifted. The congregation grew restless. People glanced at one another, eyes wide, unsure if they were all hearing the same thing. And then, without warning, the faint echoes stopped. The church returned to silence. Only the sound of breath remained. But it wasn't the breath of the audience. It was the breath of the children. 7 streams, rising and falling in perfect rhythm, filling the chapel with a pressure that seemed to swell against the walls. Witnesses later said they felt it in their bodies, a dull ache in their ribs, as if their own lungs were being forced to match. And still, no words came. The silence had become something else, something oppressive. It pressed down, thick as a storm waiting to break. One woman finally stood, clutching her child, whispering that she could not bear it. The child's ears were covered, his face pale, as though he were suffocating in the weight of the moment. Others began to shift as well, anxious murmurs rising, a nervous laugh cut short. But at the front, the Ashfords did not move. Richard's face was stern, unmoved, though his jaw tightened. Margaret's hands trembled against her dress. And the children stayed as they were. Mouths open, throats straining, no sound, until one villager whispered what many were already thinking. "They can't sing." The words rippled through the pews. Suspicion turned to fear, and that's when he heard it. A boy in the back row, barely 12, said he heard his own whisper, his own words, echoing from the front of the church, repeated softly, mocking, "They can't sing." But the children had not spoken. Their lips were still parted, their throats still taut, and yet the words lingered in the air. Others claimed the same, that the faint mutters of the congregation returned, drifting to the rafters, multiplied, distorted. Every cough, every sigh, every whispered doubt came back, stretched thin, fed into the silence until the church seemed filled with fragments of its own audience. The villagers panicked. Some stood abruptly. Others pressed their hands to their ears. The echoes were too much, too close. And then, without ceremony, the Ashford children closed their mouths. The silence broke. The echoes fell dead, and the congregation sat stunned, the air thick with something worse than sound. Collapse. No hymn had begun. No note had been sung. And yet the people swore they had heard themselves reflected in ways they could not explain. The performance ended before it had begun. Richard Ashford stepped forward, his voice calm, deliberate. He thanked the congregation for attending. He declared that the family would continue their mission in private. That would have been revealed this. Night was not failure, but proof that the voice of the divine was still being refined. No one applauded. The villagers left the church in silence, shaken, avoiding one another's eyes. Outside, the night air felt heavy, the fields unusually still. No one could explain what they had witnessed. The children of silence had opened their mouths, but it was the congregation who had been heard. And from that night on, no one in the parish ever asked to hear the Ashfords sing again, because they already had, and they could not forget it. The camera drifts toward the house again. Its stone walls seem darker now. The windows, once glinting faintly in the sun, are hidden under heavy curtains. What little light escapes comes only from the chapel wing. It flickers against the trees in strange, pulsing rhythms. At first, no one thought much of it. Families have seasons of withdrawal, grief, shame, a failure too public to bear. The Ashfords had announced a performance. Their children, groomed in silence, were meant to reveal their hymn. And when nothing emerged, only the stillness of parted lips, the silence was heavier than any note could have been. That silence followed them home. For weeks, the villagers did not see them in the marketplace. The carriages no longer rattled down the lane. Servants stopped bringing linens to wash or grain to trade. The house grew inward, shutting itself against the world. But something wasn't right. At night, those who lived closest began to hear it. Faint harmonies, as though a choir had begun far away, in a valley. But the valley was silent. The sound came from the Ashford estate. They said it was not singing. Not quite. The voices did not rise with words. They stretched long and thin, like a bow across a string that never released, a chord that never resolved. And beneath it, something worse. More than one villager swore they had heard crying, low, human, yet slowly, unbearably, it bent itself into the tones of an organ, as though grief itself had been pulled through pipes and keys until it became music. And that's when he heard it. A miller returning from late work paused on the road. The sound rolled across the fields. He told his wife he felt it on his ribs before he heard it in his ears. A pressure, a trembling, hollow resonance, like the air itself was being drawn toward the chapel and released again in slow waves. The following morning, the servants did not appear at market. No voices at the well, no footsteps on the path. The gates were barred from within, iron chains wrapped across them. Neighbors walked to the edge, calling out. No answer came. And yet, that night, they heard the sound again. Stronger, clearer. Some said the notes aligned too closely with the bells of the church in town. But the bells did not ring at midnight, and no hand touched them. Suspicion turned to fear. A widow named Margaret swore that as she pressed her ear to her cottage wall, she could hear whispers from the direction of the Ashford estate, not carried by wind, not words she could name, only the shape of breath, entering and leaving, as though someone stood just beyond her window. The villagers began to gather in hushed circles, at the tavern, at the church steps. Questions passed among them. Why cover the windows? Why silence the gates? Why hide children who had already failed? The priest urged patience. He said the family bore humiliation enough, but even he could not explain the sound. And when asked why his own church organ seemed to hum faintly, even when untouched, he only lowered his eyes. The rumors grew. Some swore the Ashfords had continued their rehearsals, perfecting what had failed before. Others said the music was not rehearsal at all, but lamentation, mourning for something already lost. And still others whispered darker things, that the children had been locked in the chapel, that their voices had been trained not to sing, but to disappear, that the crying the villagers heard was not grief, but protest. One boy, bold enough to climb the orchard wall, returned pale and trembling. He had seen a figure through a slit in the curtain. Not a face, not even a hand, only a pale throat, tilted upward, mouth open, silent. He swore it was one of the children, and he swore the lips were moving, but no sound reached him. By then, no one doubted the stories. The house had become an instrument. Its rounded ceilings and resonant halls turned whispers into echoes, echoes into chords. Even the walls themselves seemed to carry sound farther than they should. Each window shuttered, each door sealed, as though to trap what was building inside. The chapel doors never opened again. Weeks passed. The sounds at night grew stranger. What had once been faint harmonies now layered over themselves, high against low, until the air quivered like a struck glass. And then one night it stopped. No harmony, no weeping, only silence. The villagers waited. Hours passed. The fields lay still. And then, faintly from within the walls of the house, a new sound began. A single note, drawn out, human, but too long to belong to breath, as if someone had exhaled for minutes at a time without faltering. It rose, it bent, it deepened, until it was not a voice at all, but something resonating through the earth. The villagers who heard it never spoke of it openly, but their faces changed. They avoided the road by the estate. They crossed themselves when wind blew from its direction. By spring, even the bravest admitted it. The Ashfords had closed themselves in. The chapel doors were shut, and whatever had begun within those walls was not meant for anyone outside to hear. But one servant, dismissed before withdrawal, left a single line in her diary, a warning, a confession. They were not practicing to sing, she wrote. They were practicing to stop. The camera drifts slowly, as though caught in an unsteady breath. Through the branches of black oaks, the Ashford house looms again, no longer open to the village, its windows sealed, its gates chained. But on a winter evening in 1912, One man was welcomed inside, Father Alistair Merrill, a parish priest older than his years, called not by invitation but by insistence. The Ashfords had sent word through a trembling messenger boy. The family wanted counsel, and they wanted it soon. Merrill arrived with only his Bible and his journal. The entries that remain, stiff pages, ink blotted, sentences interrupted mid-thought, are the only first-hand record we have of what was happening behind those shut doors. At first, the house seemed ordinary, too ordinary. No sound, no movement, no footsteps in the corridors. He wrote of carpets that swallowed noise, walls that felt thick, like they were padded, he noted, not for warmth, but for silence. When he met the family, the strangeness only deepened. The children were seated in a row, 7 of them, still as statues, their hands resting neatly on their knees, their eyes lowered, never blinking at the same time. Merrill greeted them, but no child answered. He tried again, the same result, and then he noticed something that chilled him. Their mouths were moving, every one of them, opening and closing in perfect unison, lips forming words that he could not hear. He leaned closer, thinking perhaps his ears had failed him, but the silence remained. It was unbearable, a silence that felt alive, as though it pressed itself into the eardrums. But something wasn't right. Merrill turned to the parents. The Ashfords only nodded, as though this was normal. He wrote, "They do not speak, yet their mouths move, and though I hear nothing, I feel as though I am being answered." That night, he was given a room. Small, sparse. The window latched from outside. Sleep did not come easily. He lay awake, his journal open beside him, and that's when it began. A sound, faint at first, not from the hall, not from the children's rooms, from the walls. It was chanting, low, guttural syllables, too slow to be human. They rose and fell with a rhythm, but not one he recognized from any psalm or hymn. It was like hearing language through stone, and that's when he heard it. The sound did not belong to the family. It belonged to the house. Merrill pressed his ear to the plaster. It vibrated against the skin, as though the wall itself carried breath. He backed away, reciting prayer after prayer under his breath. But the words he spoke did not sound like his own. Each syllable emerged slower, heavier, dragged down by something he couldn't name. By morning, the chanting stopped, but his journal shows a change. The handwriting is erratic. The lines veer into margins. He wrote, "Their silence is not absence. It is full, too full. I fear that what has not come out of them seeps instead into the house itself." The children remain mute, their mouths opening and closing in perfect rhythm. Day after day, Merrill attempted blessings. He sprinkled water across the threshold. He recited the credo aloud, and though the parents bowed their heads, the children did not move, until, in one terrible moment, they all turned to face him. 7 sets of eyes, 7 mouths moving soundlessly, and for a brief instant, he swore he could hear them, not with his ears, but inside his own chest. He closed the journal for the last time that night. The next entry was short, just one sentence. "It is not the family that calls to me now." After that, nothing. The handwriting stops. The rest of the pages are blank. Father Merrill was never seen again. The Ashfords told the village he had left in the night, but the gate had not been opened. The lock was still chained in the morning, and from that day forward, the house carried an even deeper stillness. The kind of stillness that does not wait. It listens, and for the first time, the villagers began to ask themselves if the doors of the Ashford house were ever truly shut, because at night, when the wind fell quiet, they swore they could hear it. A voice from the walls, calling their name. The nave was dark when Father Merrill entered. The candles had long since guttered out, leaving only the dull gray light that leaked through narrow slits in the boarded windows. Dust hung in the air like fine smoke. The silence was oppressive, heavy in a way that seemed designed to press against the chest, to force each breath into shallow gulps. He had come alone. The Ashfords, he claimed, did not follow him into the chapel. They stayed behind the sealed doors of the rectory, their faces pale in the lamplight, their mouths pressed tightly shut as if refusing to speak would keep something at bay. Inside the nave, the air was cooler, damp. He took careful steps across the flagstone, the echoes of his own shoes returning to him too quickly, as though the walls wished to mimic every sound. He thought at first it was an architectural quirk. The Ashford Chapel was old, built with uneven stones and hollow beams. Resonance was expected, but something wasn't right. He paused at the center of the aisle. The silence was so exact, so clean, that it seemed artificial. He could not even hear the scurry of rats in the rafters, nor the creak of timber in the wind. It was a silence that waited, as if listening for him. And then he heard it. Not a voice. Not at first. It was a faintest tremor, like expanding against nails, like stones settling against mortar. A vibration that began beneath his shoes and traveled upward through his frame. His breath hitched. His palms grew damp. He looked around but saw no movement. The pews were empty. The altar was still. The sound grew, not from a single point, but from everywhere at once. The beams, the rafters, the walls themselves. They began to hum, low at first, then with a depth that shook his ribs. Each plank would seem to contain a tone, each stone in the wall a separate pitch. Together, they formed chords. The chapel was singing. Father Merrill staggered back against the pew, his hand clutching the polished wood. He tried to convince himself it was his imagination, that the wind had forced air through some hidden aperture. But there was no wind. The air was still. The tones merged. Words began to shape themselves. Not English, not Latin. He wrote later that it was a language formed in the marrow and heard not with the ear but with the blood. He knew instinctively that the syllables had no script, no alphabet that could contain them. They were older, raw, and yet within the impossible cadence. There were patterns. He could not mistake it. The sound was calling names. At first, the families. He swore he heard the name of Eleanor Ashford, whispered not in voice but in resonance, as though the very bricks gave breath to it. Then the children. The choir of syllables lengthened into something that could only be recognition. And then, suddenly, his own, Merrill. It came not as a cry, but as a drawn-out tone, stretched over several beams at once, vibrating in the hollow of the chapel. The wood beneath his palm seemed to pulse with the sound of it. The stone beneath his feet quivered. The air pressed into his ears as though trying to crawl inside. He stumbled back, his journal falling open against the pew. He had written earlier, cautiously, clinically. Now the ink blotched where his hand shook. He scribbled fragments, walls speak, not human, not of them. The vibrations intensified. He tried to shout, to call on prayer, but no words would leave his lips. His own voice was swallowed. His throat tightened, seized by the weight of the sound that now filled every corner of the room. The chapel sang louder, and in its depth his name repeated. Again, again, drawn out until the syllables blurred into tones. He pressed his hands over his ears. It made no difference. The sound was not carried in air. It was in the bones of the building. It was in his own bones. The pews shook. Dust fell from the rafters. The altar cloth fluttered though no wind moved it. And then, silence. Total. Absolute. He opened his eyes. The nave was still. Nothing had shifted. No boards had moved. No stones had cracked. It was as if the building had never sung at all. But the silence was worse. He felt it settle around him like a shroud, thick, suffocating. He turned and fled, his footsteps rapid against the flagstone. He did not close the chapel doors behind him. He did not look back. Later, in his journal, he tried to describe what had happened. The sound was not theirs, he wrote. The children did not sing. The Ashfords did not move their mouths. The choir was the chapel itself. Each stone a tongue, each beam a throat. They do not own this house. They are contained by it. His last entry was shorter. Tonight it sang my name again. This time it did not stop. The ink trails off there. The line ends mid-stroke. And Father Merrill was never seen in Ashford again. The camera drifts across the field where the chapel stands. Frost clings to the stone. The doors are closed. No smoke rises from the chimney. No voices move inside. It is the winter of 1871, and the Ashfords are gone. The neighbors are first to notice. The deliveries left at the gate are never retrieved. Letters go unanswered, and when the blacksmith sends his boy with an order of coal, he finds the great house shuttered, every curtain drawn, every latch fixed from within. But there is no sign of struggle, no broken lock, no shattered window, just absence. At first, they assume illness, a fever, perhaps, something that forced the family to withdraw. But weeks pass, snow gives way to thaw, and still no movement is seen in the garden, no lamps lit in the long halls. Finally, one of the neighbors dares to cross the threshold. He pushes at the gates. They open without resistance. The house is silent. Dust lies in places that had once been polished daily. Dishes remain on the table, untouched, as if a meal had been abandoned halfway through. Clothing is folded carefully at the ends of beds. Chairs are pulled back neatly. Nothing stolen, nothing broken, but the family is not there. The children's shoes remain by the hearth. The mother's shawl rests across the arm of a chair, and the father's spectacles sit on the mantel, exactly where he would have set them before evening prayers. But no breath stirs the air. No bodies are ever found. No graves are ever dug. It is as if the Ashfords simply stepped out of their home together and dissolved into surrounding fields. But something wasn't right, because the neighbors who dared linger in the house began to notice details. Tiny, inconspicuous things. A hymn book lying open on the pew in the family's private chapel. Always the same page. The paper yellowing with candle soot. The notes marked in pencil by a child's hand. And though no one was there to sing, the silence itself seemed weighted, as if the very walls were holding their breath. One visitor described it carefully. Years later, you could feel it in your teeth. A kind of humming. Not loud, not soft, just constant, like a note held forever, though no mouth gave a voice. Another reported hearing crying, but when he followed the sound, the crying thinned and became something else. A tone, a vibration that seeped into the wood of the pews, the grain of the floorboards. It wasn't coming from the rafters. It wasn't coming from the cellar. It wasn't coming from the empty house at all. It was coming from the walls. The hymnals, too, grew peculiar. Every book in the chapel, dozens of them, left open in the stalls, had been turned to the same section, the same page, the same song. And though no one could agree on the melody, each swore they recognized the rhythm, as if the building remembered it, as if the stone itself was keeping time. By spring, no one would enter. Neighbors spoke only at a distance, voices low, glances wary. Children were warned not to cross the field, not to touch the gates, not to even look too long at the shuttered windows, because something seemed to look back. And that's when the stories began. One farmer said he saw figures moving inside, not people, shadows, their steps too regular, too measured, like actors in a play rehearsed 1,000 times. Another claimed that when he passed at night, he heard the faintest chorus, notes caught between wind and breath, a choir that never began and never ended. The accounts differ in detail, but in one thing they agree. The Ashford silence had not vanished. It had been absorbed, drawn into the stone, into the mortar, into the beams and the rafters, like water soaking into wood. It seeped deeper, darker, until the house itself seemed alive with it. And those who heard it swore the sound was not music, not prayer, not lament. It was memory. Memory preserved in timber and plaster. Memory that refused to die. The last witness willing to speak of it was a schoolteacher from the next town over. He went in search of the family's records, hoping to trace what happened. Birth certificates, death notices, transfers. There were none. No Ashfords listed after 1871. No graves in the churchyard. No markers in the parish books. It was as if they had never lived. The teacher left shaken. His account in a local gazette closed with a single line, a warning written not for curiosity, but for survival. Do not enter the chapel, for its silence is not absence, it is presence. And the camera lingers on the chapel door, still shut, would warp by decades of weather, but hinges intact, lock unbroken. Behind it lies nothing, and everything, the absence of a family, the echo of a song that was never sung, the memory of voices that were never allowed to fade. But if you listen too closely, you may find the silence begins to listen back. And that's where the story breaks. Because by the end of 1871, the Ashfords were gone, but their house remained, and in the stillness of its rooms, the sound of their silence had only just begun. The chapel sat quietly in the field. Its stones had darkened with the weight of decades. Its timbers groaned faintly with the pressure of rain and heat. And yet it stood. By the 1960s, the Ashford Chapel was already a relic, unattended, unwanted, but never fallen. Its windows, broken long ago, were patched by nothing but ivy. The wooden door sagged inward, one hinge straining with the memory of use. The roof bowed, though it had not collapsed. From a distance, it looked abandoned, but up close, it looked preserved. Too preserved. And that was why a folklorist named Richard Gable came. He had heard rumors of the place, that the family had vanished, that no graves were ever dug, that the chapel remained open, as if waiting. In the summer of 1963, Gable carried a portable reel-to-reel recorder into the nave. His notes were careful, measured. He wanted proof of the legends, proof of silence, he wrote, that the Ashfords had left behind. The machine was heavy. He set it down near the altar. Its metallic shell caught the dull light, reflecting shapes from the high rafters. Dust circled slowly in the air. He pressed record. The tape began to turn. The first sound it caught was nothing, only the faint creak of wood as Gable adjusted his seat, only the shifting of papers as he noted the date, the hour, the humidity. The chapel, he wrote, was still, but something wasn't right. When he closed his notebook and listened, really listened, he noticed the silence was not empty. It had weight, like a pressure in the ear, as if the absence of sound was itself a sound. He sat longer. 30 minutes passed. 40. His recorder spooled faithfully, winding silence onto magnetic ribbon. And then he felt it, a rhythm, subtle at first, so faint he thought it was the blood in his head. A cycle, steady, slow, a pattern of inhalation, exhalation, breathing. He searched the rafters. No bird stirred. He checked the corners. No insects clicked. He was alone, yet he could hear it. 7 voices, not speaking, not chanting, not whispering, breathing. Each breath a line, timed, paced. A shared inhale, a shared exhale, as though lungs were hidden inside the walls themselves. And that's when he heard it, his own breath, no longer his. The rhythm was pulling at him, guiding his lungs, setting his pace. He tried to breathe faster, then slower, but each time he fell back into sync with the 7. It was as though he had been added to their choir. His journal shows panic in the pen strokes. The letters grow uneven, jagged. He wrote, "Not me, not mine." Still, the tape spun. When he left the chapel that night, he was pale. He packed the recorder quickly. He didn't speak until he was back on the road. The next day, he played it. Nothing. The room filled with empty static. No birds. No insects. No shifting wood. Just a smooth, oppressive silence. But after several minutes, there it was, the breathing. Soft, faint, measured. 7 voices. The tape had caught what the ear could not. But something else appeared, too, a distortion, as though the air itself bent inward, pulled tight by the sound. Listeners described it as pressure at the temples, a slow tightening of the throat. Gable brought the recording to colleagues, anthropologists, musicologists, even physicists. Each played it once. Each reacted the same way. Their voices faltered. Their sentences stopped mid-word. Their tongues felt thick, unwilling to form syllables. For days afterward, they reported headaches, dizziness, difficulty speaking, as though the silence had stolen something. One man, a professor of folklore, noted that he could still hear the rhythm while trying to sleep. It wasn't sound, he explained. It was expectation. The body anticipated the breath, even without hearing it. His dreams were full of the pattern. Inhale, Exhale, inhale, exhale. Always 7. Never 6. Never 8. 7. The machine was studied. No faults were found. The ribbon was clean. The reel operated normally. It wasn't a malfunction. It was a recording of silence, and the silence was alive. But something wasn't right. The more people listened, the less they spoke. Some forgot words entirely. Some found their mouths shaping sound without voice, just as the Ashfords had done. A librarian who handled the tape wrote in the margin of a memo, "Their mouths move, but nothing comes out." It matched Father Merrill's journal, nearly a century earlier. The same phenomenon, the same silence. The chapel had not forgotten, nor had it released the voices it absorbed. And that left the question, if silence could be recorded, what was it waiting for? Gable stopped playing the tape. He sealed it, labeled it, stored it in his archive. His notes ended abruptly, but others had heard it. A rumor spread among students who visited his collection that if you pressed your ear against the archive drawer, you could feel the rhythm, slow and patient. 7 voices, breathing in the dark, and those who dared listen longer claimed something else. The silence adjusted. It grew aware of them. It folded their own breath into the count. And once you were counted, you never quite escaped it. The folklorist's work faded. His later writings were sparse. He retired quietly, speaking little. His voice had grown thin, distant, as if part of him had remained in that chapel, wound onto magnetic tape, waiting for the next ear to press play. By the late 1960s, the reel was all but forgotten, cataloged, filed, ignored. But silence doesn't die. Silence endures. And the breathing never stopped. The scream begins in darkness. A faint, shaking glow of a flashlight drags across warped wood. Dust swirls, caught like stars in its beam, floating in the stale, unmoving air. The camera jitters in the grip of its holder. The sound of boots crunching against stone and splintered pews beneath. And a voice whispers, half excitement, half nerves. We're in. It was present day. 3 urban explorers, all young, all chasing the promise of online notoriety, had chosen the Ashford Chapel as their prize. It had stood sealed, shuttered, ignored for more than a century. The locals spoke of it only in passing, and never with comfort. The explorers had brought phones, cameras, lights, and a live stream. Their followers watched in real time as the trio pushed past rusted hinges, stepping into a silence that seemed too heavy for a building so small. At first, it looked like nothing more than decay. Wood warped, stone cracked, hymnals curled open where moisture had stained the pages into permanent waves. The camera panned slowly, cautiously. The walls were intact. The altar remained, and the air smelled of dust and iron. But something wasn't right. The silence wasn't ordinary silence. It felt dense, pressed inward, as if the walls themselves had been waiting, listening, for someone to enter. The explorers joked nervously into the stream. They laughed, but their laughter died quickly. The sound did not echo. It was swallowed, immediately, completely, and their audience noticed. Comments flickered across the screen. Why is it so quiet? Is your mic broken? Talk again. The explorers shouted, trying to prove the audio was working. Their lips moved, their throats strained, but no sound came through. The stream showed their mouths forming words, clear, deliberate, exaggerated. Yet the audience heard nothing but the faint static hum of an open channel. And that's when they saw it. The 3 voices were moving together, not shouting, not laughing, praying. Every follower watching at home typed in confusion. The explorers' lips were moving in unison. Each syllable matched, synchronized, as if rehearsed. But the explorers themselves did not seem to realize it. Their faces looked confused, panicked even, and yet their lips kept moving. Perfectly. Together, the chat exploded. Are they messing with us? They're not talking. Look at their mouths. The words were silent, but the rhythm was unmistakable. A cadence, a prayer, 7 beats, just as the folklorist had once recorded, just as the priest had once described. And then the stream cut out. Darkness filled the screen. The connection ended without warning. No outro, no laughter, no screams, only silence. Hours later, a hiker found the camera. It sat upright, propped against a pew, lens cracked but still recording. Battery blinking red, seconds from dying. He turned it over to authorities. They played back the final footage. It showed the chapel exactly as it had stood for centuries. Still, unmoved. But the camera did not remain still. It shook, as though something heavy had brushed against it. The frame tilted slowly upward, and for a moment, just a moment, the walls seemed to quiver. Not collapse, not fall, quiver, as though holding in a breath, as though listening. And in the corner of the frame, barely caught by the failing lens, the hymnals remained open, the same page, the same verse, untouched, but their edges fluttered, not from wind. There was no draft, no movement of air. The flutter was rhythmic, like breathing, like 7 voices in unison. The camera click died, and the tape fell into silence. But silence in Ashford's chapel had never been still. Witnesses who handled the footage later claimed the silence was worse than sound. They said it lingered in their homes, that for nights after, their sleep was shallow, their throats ached. One claimed he woke to find himself mouthing words he didn't know, his lips dry, his tongue heavy, but no sound emerged. Others simply refused to discuss it at all. They returned the footage, resigned, and spoke no further. The explorers were never found, not in the chapel, not in the woods, not in any town or record beyond that final night. But their audience, the hundreds who had watched the live stream, the thousands who replayed the corrupted footage online, they swore they remembered the prayer, not the words, not the language, the rhythm, 7 beats, like a choir, but not one that sang, one that waited, one that listened, one that prayed. The Ashford Chapel remained silent. The hymnals remain open. The walls remain still. But silence is not absence, and silence does not forget, because silence here moves, it waits, it listens, and sooner or later, it learns your name. What is more terrifying, voices that scream or the silence that remembers?